Hey folks, and welcome to Workshop 2, Module 2 on Social Prevention. Before we get into social prevention in more detail, we want to have a look at Felson's crime triangle again. We looked at that in the previous workshop, and you'll recall that Felson's crime triangle has a target, a lack of capable guardianship, and a motivated offender. And when these three things are in place, crime happens. Now, social prevention is addressing the motivated offender part of the triangle. Now, this is not to say that social prevention specifically thinks about Felson's crime triangle. This diagram is to help us understand how we could relate the two frameworks together. And my suggestion is that we can place social prevention broadly on the motivated offender triangle because that's what it's trying to address. And social prevention actually tries to prevent the motivated offender from existing. Let's think about some of the strength of social prevention. It has a special attraction for criminologists because it challenges the assumption or the belief that public shaming and social exclusion are the only mechanisms for reducing crime. It looks at effective inclusion in social institutions such as family, community, and education to lower the rates of offending. So aside from any social justice or social equity arguments you might have about social prevention, redistributive policies can help achieve a more law-abiding and secure society. Redistributive in the sense of providing poorer communities with the resources to develop better institutions, to develop more effective inclusion. That said, the social prevention process is difficult because the law and order politics and the image of tough leadership that dominates contemporary society means that it's easier to sell to the mass media a tough law and order policy or election promise, and it's easier to sell this to the public than the longer term, less easily or less immediately visible impacts of social prevention. Another thing to think about is that there's little consensus on how different understandings about social prevention should translate into specific policies. Something you want to keep in mind is that some criminologists draw a comparison between social crime prevention and public health, and that is in the sense of a typology. Now, what this typology is all about is which level of the population is your social prevention intervention targeting. When we talk about primary level or primary prevention, that's the whole of the population, across the board. Secondary is referring to specific groups that are deemed at risk of offending. And tertiary prevention is addressing those groups who already experience problems, those who have already offended. A little bit more detail about primary prevention. Some of the things involved in this is about, say, ensuring children transition to formal education equipped with basic planning and problem-solving skills, developing parent and child bonding through parental attachment, nurturing, and consistent discipline, or in other areas, publicity campaigns to change widespread behaviours like the Violence Against Women Australia Says No campaign from 2006 and 2007, and we're also talking about things like community development initiatives, helping local neighbourhoods become more cohesive and exercise effective informal social control. So you may recall from other criminology units these ideas of social cohesion and collective efficacy, and this is where these ideas are coming together at the community level. A little bit more about primary prevention. It's drawing on a few different social theories. It's drawing on social disorganization theory, which is suggesting that important correlates of violent crime are going to include concentrated disadvantage, low residential stability, a high transitory population, in other words, or high immigrant concentration, which is less to do with saying, particular, it's not to do about racist ideas about who should be where, but rather because of this idea of anomie from Emile Durkheim, shifting in different norms over a short period of time. That said, neighborhoods with those above risk factors, but that also have close knit and trusting relationships and higher levels of informal social control. So, one example of this is neighborhoods where adults do intervene to control or correct young people's behavior, and people act in the community interest, tend to have lower than expected rates of violence. So that's what we're talking about when we have this idea of social cohesion. So social disorganization is talking about, the inability to share or achieve norms and goals, and concentrated disadvantage. Social cohesion or social cohesiveness is talking about good levels of social capital, good social relations between the community, a shared investment and identity or identification with the community, therefore being able to instigate better levels of informal social control. And this can lower expected rates of violence, for example. So, in other words, social cohesion has a buffering effect on tight knit communities against risk factors for crime. Let's talk about secondary prevention now. So, secondary prevention is about at risk groups or at risk populations, and this form of prevention tends to appeal to governments more because they're perceived as cost effective, and they often employ risk assessment theory or risk assessment techniques. And there are two approaches: the developmental and the pathway approach to social secondary prevention. Let's talk about the developmental approach, which is also called the trajectory approach. This idea comes from previous generational and cohort studies, which are studies across the lifespan of populations. And these have identified common factors in the minority of people who accumulate serious criminal records. And some of these issues are things like impulsivity, poor social and problem solving skills, poverty, family history of crime, inadequate parental supervision, and so on. Now, this developmental approach says, well, these key issues can be identified early in life, between birth and the age of 5 years old. And so you have this idea of a trajectory that from that 5-year-old point, people are either going to be on a more criminal or less criminal trajectory through life. Now, I've put a hand-drawn diagram here to help sort of express this, and you can see on the left-hand side the 0 to 5 years, and then depending on what background you're from is where you're starting on, and then depending on whether the intervention happens at around the 5-year mark will depend on whether you continue along a trajectory towards less criminality or towards more criminality. Now, there's an alternative view, which is the pathways or the phases or the transitional approach, meaning roughly the same thing. Some criminologists reject the trajectory metaphor because they say that this idea of one steady march towards adulthood fixed after early childhood is problematic. It's kind of reductionist in that sense. So they talk instead about a series of phases or a series of transitions across the lifespan, especially during the developmental years or adolescence. With each transition come new challenges that could lead a young person to drift towards antisocial behavior. So I've done another hand-drawn diagram here to help us make sense of the transitional or pathways approach as compared to the trajectory approach. So it's a similar layout, except you have multiple transition points across the life course, and at each one, a person could drift towards more criminality or less criminality. And you might make progress at one transition point towards less criminality and then go back towards more criminality at another transition point later on if your life is more challenging. Okay, what are some of these transition points? These might be things such as moving to a new school, starting high school, moving to a new city, parents undergoing divorce, those sorts of life changes. These are seen as transition points where social interventions might occur. Now, this takes us then to tertiary prevention, which is, if you'll recall, addressing populations that have already offended. Now, something to keep in mind is that there's a wide range of schemes, and the idea is to rehabilitate those who have already offended. These might be prison-based or in the community once they've left prison. One example that you'll come across, if you haven't already, in your other criminology units is this idea of restorative justice. And there's a strong emphasis on tertiary prevention there. And restorative justice, in short, is sanctioning or shaming individuals followed by a rehabilitative or reintegrative process, which is called reintegrative shaming. This is basically the idea that you use the emotion of shame and get people to acknowledge their guilt and the harm done to the people they've harmed, and use that process to help bring them back into the mainstream set of values, or back into mainstream society, if you will. Now, let's talk about the affective aspects of social prevention. You'll recall previously we talked about affect and emotion and that sort of thing in thinking about crime prevention. Now, crime and social control policy are always complex, and decisions must function at two levels: the effective, what are the effects or outcomes, and the affective level, what are the feelings, what's the symbolism behind these things. This is, again, you can compare this to the language used previously of instrumental and symbolic emotional, okay? Effective, instrumental, affective, symbolic, emotional. Now, the affective level is often overlooked by researchers and practitioners, but this should not be ignored. Governments are usually keyed into focus groups and opinion polls and things like that, and policies must resonate with public perceptions and public emotions. So social prevention policies convey powerful symbolic messages. So it all depends on context. What are the dominant, pervasive cultural narratives about the corrupting effects of our sophisticated urban lifestyles? What are the effects of living in cities and suburbs, and how might these be, shaping us in different ways? This is one of the dominant, symbolic, emotional frameworks through which a lot of crime prevention is being framed. Now, what are some of the challenges associated with social prevention? Well, there's a common mistaken view that social prevention is the only viable crime reduction method because the situational and environmental approaches, which we'll talk about in later workshops, only address the symptoms. The thing is, also, crime refers to a diverse range of activities. There's no such thing as crime in general when you really think about it. It's just specific instances and forms of criminal acts. So just talking about crime, it's really vague and it's a little bit hollow, and we might benefit from being a bit more specific when we're talking about crime. Additionally, there isn't much evidence that individuals who are prevented from committing opportunistic offences or offences due to carelessness, such as drink driving, invariably look for other opportunities to break the law. That is, situational preventions don't result in the would-be offender looking for some other way to break the law. If you're prevented from drink driving by an immobilizer, you don't then go out and look for someone to assault, right? Now let's think about the scope of social interventions. Excessive social prevention, especially when it's interpreted as a pressure to make people conform, can be experienced as stifling and restrictive. The systematic delivery of basic resources, taken for granted by middle class populations, to disadvantaged families with young children in many countries, results in surprisingly large reductions in crime involvement among those targeted. The key challenge of social prevention is isolating those key ingredients to ensure that these are provided to the communities that need them. Something worth thinking about as well is the role of social class and prevention. When middle or upper middle class people ensure that their children cope with life's major challenges and transitions, they generally don't perceive themselves as practicing social crime prevention. It seems only when these are discussed in terms of disadvantaged populations do these things get framed as something extra, that you need research-based guidance and monitoring to provide basics for disadvantaged populations. In other words, it's not considered social prevention when it's well-resourced or advantaged populations doing it. So it's interesting to think about some of those differences and tensions between similar practices being undertaken by middle and upper class populations and lower socioeconomic and disadvantaged populations as well. Now, there were three examples of past social prevention programs. I'm not going to go into those in too much detail, but some of the key points are on the slide. But the sort of gist of it is that they were addressing people from a young age, children, and they've conducted longitudinal studies to track their progress over time. Some of these programs, such as the Perry Preschool Project, was focused more on preventing broader social problems, not just crime, but the outcomes or the effects of the intervention also had a crime preventing aspect as well. Now, there's also the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study from the 1930s in the US, which is an example of what's considered a failed program. And effectively, what we want to learn from this is that it's a warning not to rush into social programs without effective planning and thinking through. Follow-up studies of this intervention found that the target group scored worse on most measures. They had more extensive criminal records, less educational success, higher rates of mental illness, and higher suicide rates. So let's think about what's happened here. Most programs this then leads to the importance of the role of design. A key lesson from this case is that implementation of a program is as important as the content. How a program is delivered is as important as what's in it. In the Perry Preschool case, which was a previous example of a successful social prevention intervention, there was a focus on educational outcomes. However, crime prevention was a collateral benefit, an unplanned or unintended consequence. So the question is, should social prevention focus on individuals or social structures and institutions? There's consistent research showing associations between arrest and imprisonment rates and general indicators of disadvantage, such as unemployment, low income, early school leaving, and physical and mental illness. And you might also think about how this relates to the idea of strain theory and blocked opportunities as well. Now, the Pathways to Prevention project, which was a developmental prevention approach, is an example of a successful Australian project. It targeted transition points in young people's lives, such as changing social identities, moving between social institutions like home and school, because things can go wrong at these crucial points, especially for disadvantaged young people, and this has an impact on their problematic behaviour. So this project was implemented in culturally and linguistically diverse communities as well as Indigenous communities. Now, it began as a demonstration program with the influence of federal and state policies on early interventions. But the key lesson of this case study was the need to adopt a holistic approach to early intervention. So there's a focus on understanding how different contexts, different institutions, different social contexts impact child development. It was also a plan-based approach. It identified how key institutions and agencies interact with one another to enhance the developmental pathways of children. So interagency coordination, this is something that is difficult to achieve, but it can be enhanced by an engaged coordinator with excellent interpersonal skills. The challenge, as always, is that this is usually constrained by resource competition and funding arrangements to different organizations and institutions. Now, this leads us to some implementation challenges for social prevention. Unless structural inequality is also addressed, programs that are focused on high-risk individuals or families or communities may have limited impact on offending incidence rates. Some criminologists will critique certain forms of social prevention that don't address structural inequality as effectively shuffling the deck chairs, which means that program participants are helped with social advancement at the expense of those with similar disadvantage but no assistance. So we hold some people back, we push some people forward, but at the end of the day, the net result is the problem stays the same. Now, the cost benefits of social interventions, based on comparing program participants with equally disadvantaged young people who were excluded from the program. So it's worth thinking about, who do we include in these programs and who do we exclude, and at what broader social cost, and are we effectively measuring this idea of cost benefit in terms of how we've designed our interventions. The designers of the successful Perry Preschool project actually wanted their scheme to be universally accessible, not selective. They wanted it to be a primary prevention rather than secondary, at-risk communities. However, the problem with universal projects, the problem with these primary interventions, is not just that they're costly, but it runs counter to the dominant neoliberal political logic of the day. And in contemporary society, this neoliberal political logic has certain values such as cutting public spending on education, health and welfare, and transferring responsibility to the private sector. So in summary, we've seen how important it is to view social prevention as a holistic approach to crime prevention. We've seen that it doesn't need to be named crime prevention for it to be effective. The Perry Preschool Project example was an education and social intervention that had the benefit of crime prevention outcomes. Now, sometimes social prevention interventions in targeting particular groups ends up labeling them as potential deviants, and this labeling could be counterproductive to crime prevention outcomes. Social prevention should be broad and inclusive as much as possible. It's also something that has to address, or has to be done structurally to address issues around how community resources and social resources are distributed among disadvantaged populations. It's also a political process, and the politics of the day and the political dynamics of particular organizations and communities intrinsically shape crime prevention at the policy, planning, and project level. Some of the challenges are for social prevention to be liberating, not oppressive, and for it to be empowering rather than stigmatizing. You need a broad brush and consultative approach, so it requires much negotiating and planning with affected communities. Social prevention also needs to resonate at both the practical and symbolic affective levels, right? Not just does this program work, not just that instrumental element, but also the affective, emotional, symbolic component. Is this creating the society that we have a shared vision for? And one more thing is, the more that these social prevention measures are incorporated into everyday or routine practice, the more effective these will be. So rather than seeing them as this outside program or something that some people do, if you can better integrate that into the everyday experience of disadvantaged communities, particularly disadvantaged young people, it will have better outcomes.